Okay, good evening. Welcome to Together Women Rise's book club event. I'm Jan Richards, and I'm a volunteer on the book club committee. And I'm a chapter member in Venice, Florida. I'll be your moderator this evening, along with Vicki Bush-Joseph, who is another volunteer in the book club committee, and she's also on our board of directors. We're really pleased to have all of you here today for what is going to be a fascinating conversation and discussion about the book Guardians of the Trees, a journey of hope through healing the planet. And we're thrilled to have the author, Dr. Kinari Webb, as our guest speaker. Kinari is also the founder of Health in Harmony, one of Together Women Rise's grantees. Before we get started, there's a lot of people joining us, so here's a few Zoom instructions in case you're not familiar with how things go. Please mute yourself now, if you would, and stay muted at all times during the presentation. If you have not already, please enter in the chat where you're from. We'd like to know the various places that folks are joining from. And also, if you have questions for our discussion a little bit later on, please enter them in the chat, and Wendy will be monitoring those so that we're ready to throw lots of questions at Dr. Webb when the time comes. There's closed captioning that has been enabled on this meeting. So if that would be helpful for you, you can turn it on the toolbar for your Zoom. We have members and guests here and others who may be completely new to Together Women Rise, but everyone is welcome. We're a powerful community of women and allies that's been dedicated to achieving global gender equality for the past 20 years. We've hundreds of local chapters across the US where members learn about gender equality issues, give grants to organizations that empower women and girls in low-income countries, and build community to forge meaningful connections with each other and with women and girls around the world. Our book club is just another way to engage in our mission and to learn about global gender equality issues, to experience community with others who care about making the world a better place for women and girls. For more information on our book club and how to get involved with Together Women Rise, please visit our website at togetherwomenrise.org. In a moment, I'm going to turn it over to Vicki for our special conversation with our guest speaker. Vicki's going to lead the conversation, and then our speaker will answer a few of your questions. Don't forget to put questions in the chat if you have them. We've chosen to forgo our usual breakout groups so that we can spend more time in conversation with the author, but don't worry, we'll still have book giveaways at the end. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Vicki and she'll introduce our guest speaker.
Thank you, Jan. So pleased to see so many friends and people I've traveled with Rise and chapter members and regional leaders and great volunteers and staff. So thank you guys for joining us. We are pleased to have Dr. Kinari Webb, the author of Guardians of the Trees, as our guest speaker tonight. Dr. Webb founded Health in Harmony as a response to the devastation she saw in the rainforests of West Kalimantan, Indonesia, with a mission to recognize the inextricable link between human and environmental health and a focus on providing healthcare as an incentive to protect natural resources. Health in Harmony is working toward a healthy planet for all. The seeds of a future in Indonesia were first sown for Kinari Webb in 1993 while studying orangutans in Gunung Padang National Park. Bearing witness to the dichotomy of a beautiful and simultaneously threatened rainforest and experiencing firsthand the travesties befalling local communities with regards to healthcare, Kinari vowed to complete medical training and return to Indonesia. Dr. Webb graduated from Yale University's School of Medicine with honors and completed her residency in family medicine at Contra Costa Regional Medical Center in Martinez, California in 2005. Health in Harmony was founded shortly thereafter. She then moved to Indonesia and began work around arguably the most precious national park in the country, called Gunung Palung National Park in West Kalimantan. In listening to local rainforest communities, Dr. Webb and her Indonesian colleagues found that the need for affordable healthcare and training in sustainable agricultural techniques were driving illegal logging. Through a co-designed healthcare system and integrated economic development work, over 10 years, illegal logging households dropped by 90%. Infant mortality declined 67%. Loss of primary forest was halted, and over 52,000 acres of new forest grew back. The carbon impact is estimated conservatively at $53 million. With Health and Harmony support, this model is now operating in 9 million hectares of land in Indonesia, Madagascar, and Brazil. Given the success of these sites, Health and Harmony is preparing to scale globally in partnership with Pawanka Fund and Woodwell Climate Research Center. Dr. Webb was honored with an Ashoka Social Entrepreneur Fellowship in 2014 and was selected as a Rainier Arnold Fellow through the Mulago Foundation in the same year. In 2017, she gave the commencement address at Yale Medical School. Kinari's work has been profiled in Oprah Magazine, BBC, PBS's NewsHour with Jim Lehrer, National Geographic, the Sierra Club, Mongabe, 4 Indonesian TV channels, Tempo Magazine, Compass Newsletter, and The Voice of America. Welcome, Kinari.
Thank you so much. It's such an honor to be here.
Well, we are so glad to have you, and we've got lots of questions. So let's get started with one of the more obvious ones. The subtitle of your book is A Journey of Hope Through Healing the Planet. Why do you call your story A Journey of Hope?
Well, I don't know. It's terrifying. It's scary what's happening to our planet. We have a process of extractivism, right? Where we are taking from the world and we are giving little back, and that's going to turn around and really hurt us. And I didn't know if it was possible to do something different. I didn't know if it was possible to switch a downward spiral to an upward spiral. And it is, right? I would say that I personally had very little hope about it. I did the work. I felt like I really literally felt like a fish swimming against a tsunami. It's like, well, I'm going to swim in the right direction, but the tsunami is coming this way. And I have to say, every time and now I no longer live in Kalimantan, I have now moved away, but every time I go back, it's just like, I cannot believe the changes that are happening. And in Madagascar, the same. It's just so quickly and so dramatically. And that gives me hope. And I want other people to have that too.
I think that might be why your book is so popular and why I was so encouraged and inspired to suggest it for Together Women Rise, because there is such hope. And those statistics that you gave us, that we shared, are just fabulous. So really encouraging.
And you know, those statistics are just like, they're like a summary of hundreds of thousands of stories, right? And stories that are so beautiful and profound and moving and life-changing. And that's, you know, I'll share some of those stories tonight with you all, but I wish you could all experience all of them, because that's where the real hope and power lies. Yeah.
Well, we were talking about possibly planning a trip for some of us who might be lucky enough to go to Indonesia and visit ASRI, the organization that Health and Harmony works with there. So, so talking about your book talks about the intersection of medicine and conservation. And when you first went to Indonesia early on, you learned and saw firsthand the connection between the health of the environment and the health of humans. Can you
Yeah.
tell us more about how this became apparent to you and why it has continued to be such a focus of your work?
Well, I mean, sometimes I joke with people. I say, we save rainforests with a stethoscope. And then people are like, what? What are you talking about? Those things don't go together, right? And and I would say that's kind of what I thought too. They don't go together. But when there I was in Indonesia, hearing the chainsaws in the distance, and then learning that people were logging to pay for healthcare, that was just dramatically life-changing for me. Just it made me realize how little I understood what was really going on. But then when you hear about someone who cuts down 60 giant rainforest trees to pay for a C-section, you get it, right? Or women who, have to pay 5 2x4s every single month just for birth control, right? That that is just so horrific to think about, this negative cycle of destruction. And especially when the local communities 100% know that their well-being now and in the future is dependent on these forests. And they also know that the world's well-being is dependent on these forests. In Kalimantan, the words that they use, paru-paru dunia, the lungs of the forest, like they literally understand the forest in that way. And they understand that they are guardians of something that affects the health of the whole planet. They don't want to destroy the forest. They just don't have a choice. And I thought, we can't have a world where that's the case. Yeah.
We heard something similar a couple of weeks ago. We were able to speak with the chief science officer and CEO um, for the Diane Fossey Gorilla Fund, who's our
Yeah.
featured grantee this month. And their motto is helping people, saving gorillas.
Yeah.
So same, but different.
Same.
Um,
Same.
It's
Yeah.
doing some of the same work that Health and Harmony is doing, helping people with alternatives to logging so that they can pay for emergencies, or and teaching different farming techniques, so that there's they don't have to. In the case of the gorillas in Rwanda, it was going into the forest because they needed firewood, they needed
Yeah. Of course.
some of the resources from the forest. And
Yes.
very similar from your book is what I'm picking up in Borneo as well, in Indonesia. So
And then, of course, as there's that intense interface between communities and forest, you can also end up with pandemic risk, right? Because then there's a spillover from viruses and bacteria that can be spread between humans and wildlife. So that's another whole different way to think about this inner being, right? Human well-being and forest well-being, both locally and globally.
you give a
Yeah.
couple of examples of that in your book, but can you elaborate on that a little bit? Because I'm not sure we get that. It doesn't, it might not make sense to those of us who haven't studied in this area.
Yeah. So I'll give you a few examples, but there are many, many examples. So the Nipah virus is an interesting one. This is an example from the island of Borneo. When the forest was very heavily degraded, then the bats no longer had their roosts and their like enough food. And so then they were coming into the communities and eating fruit in the trees there. And then they were, because their bodies were so stressed, they were spreading a lot of virus. Those virus were then going into the chickens and the pigs in the communities, which then was spreading to humans, right? The Nipah virus is not one that has been a massive pandemic, although it was a local huge pandemic, and it's one that could be a global pandemic, right? So the more that you can have healthy forest, because then the animals are healthy, they're less likely to spread virus. And the humans are healthy, so that if there is an outbreak, the humans can also be cared for. With both are healthy, you have the risk of spillover is very low. And as we all know, with the coronavirus, that when you have too much spillover and when it can go global, right? And that is a devastating event. And the risk of spillover has been increasing with the pressure on the forest, because there's the highest biodiversity in rainforest. So the risk is the highest for spillover. So that's why, it's just another way of really thinking about this well-being of the forest is so important for the health of the entire planet, in terms of biodiversity, in terms of carbon, in terms of water cycling, because the rainforests also create water all around the planet. But also human well-being is so important for the health of the forest and the health of people everywhere. So, but there are many examples. HIV is one, that came from the forest. There's like many, many, many of them. So Ebola. Yeah.
Yeah. Ebola was the one that jumped to mind for me.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then the other potential problem that you talked about was malaria, that
Yes.
you wouldn't normally see, but because once the forest, the trees are cut down, there's more standing water, there's more mosquitoes, which leads to more malaria. So.
And the amazing thing is, in the communities in Kalimantan where we work now, we haven't had like a single case of local malaria in like 6 years now. I mean, that's amazing to actually go to zero, right? And that's because the forest is protected. Humans are, if they do get malaria, they're treated, we have bed nets as well. Now, in Madagascar, where we're just starting to work, there's lots and lots and lots of malaria, like there was in the beginning when we started in Kalimantan. But we're hoping that will also really come down. So,
and I'm sure you did the baseline measuring there, like you did in Kalimantan.
yes.
That was very impressive too, to start with, knowing where you started, so that these stats are even more impressive. That's great. So let's jump to the concept of radical listening. This was one of my favorite parts of the book, because I
My
love
favorite part too.
yeah, I love the terminology, but I also love the concept, and it shouldn't be so radical that we listen to the people that the not-for-profits are trying to serve. But it makes all the sense in the world to me, but it's not. It's your example of after the tsunami, with the big organizations coming in, and that was one example. There were all sorts of malaria meds, but you were in an area that didn't need malaria meds. So good gone wrong. So can you talk a little bit about radical listening, what it means, and how you have used it in your work, starting in Indonesia and now spreading to these other areas?
Well, I just feel like radical listening is the absolute core of what we do. And it should not be radical. It should just be normal. It should be the way every organization works. But they don't, right? And actually, I would say the whole system doesn't work that way, right? So it's not only that nonprofits are not listening to communities, but they're getting money from donors who don't have a system, right, for also making sure that communities are being listened to. And then even giving it like, well, we'll give money for whatever the communities need, right? That would be the ideal, right? It's a process of love and respect. It is a process of reciprocity, of understanding that we are all giving gifts, and that it is not charity. Communities are giving something so powerful and so important to the whole world. And this process is a process of asking them what they need is in gratitude for that. And then, or maybe need is not even the right solution, the answer, the right word. It's like, what are the solutions so that they can thrive more and the forest can thrive more? And then the world thrives more, right? So we're all benefiting here. And the communities are very clear about what the solutions are. And the thing that just really got me in the beginning was that every single community all the way around Gunung Palung National Park came to the same conclusions about what the solutions were. And they were solutions that I never would have come to as an outsider. So that process for me was like, I have to 100% trust the communities, because even if I don't necessarily understand it, and in some cases, like they asked for organic farming training, I was like, seriously, like that is weird. Like, like, okay, but like, can't you just talk to your grandparents, or like, what, you know, like what, why do you need that, right? But it was only like 5 years later that I began to understand all the layers of why that was important, because they were logging to pay for the chemical fertilizers that they were then getting into debt with. And, you know, these just downward negative spirals, and then health impacts, and then the soil getting worse over time, and the traditional forms of agriculture that they used to use no longer working. And so we could bring in experts from the next door island of Java in the case of Indonesia, or in Madagascar, you know, just some hours away, there were experts, you know, that we could bring in certain specific types of agriculture that they wanted training in. And we have just been stunned to see how much communities know exactly what the solutions are, and that that their solutions work. They work so well, right? And another amazing thing about it is when the communities decide what they want and how they're going to do it, they do it. Like in Madagascar, they had wanted this very specific type of training for agriculture, in addition to some other intersectional solutions, including healthcare. But the first training in a population of 2,000 people, 900 people showed up for that training, right? Because they wanted it. So they were going to be there immediately. So even if there's some theoretical other, maybe better solution, the solution the communities come to is the one they're going to do.
And can you talk a little bit, for those who haven't maybe finished the book yet, about how you actually went about that? Did you do, you know, I know how you did it, but can you talk a little bit about the method?
I mean, it's not that complicated. It's mostly listening, right? We usually have an insider listener, so someone that's their local language. They grew up in that area, and the communities recognize them as someone local. And then an outside listener who should ideally speak that language, if they don't have a translator. And then it's important that that person can also help represent the global community. But that may be that they come from the city, right? It doesn't mean that they need to come from very far away. And then you sit in a circle with a group of community members. It doesn't need to be both women and men, which in some places, like in Madagascar, it's a little complicated because they're not accustomed to both men and women being in the same meeting. But the way we explained it was, we said, we're here to ask the experts what the solutions are. You are the experts, but women are experts in some parts of life, and men are experts in other parts of life, and we need to hear both sides, right? And they said, with that explanation, they're like, okay, we get it. And then I'll tell you a funny story, which is that years later, after we solved all these, you know, begun to really address all these community solutions, one of the outside listeners came back to these communities in Madagascar, and it was the women who called up the meetings, and they wanted to tell everyone, we have to tell you how things are going. It's amazing, you know, we can't believe it. You actually listened to us. We told you what the solutions were. You actually did them, and now we have, you know, we are no longer afraid of the hunger season. All look around you, look how healthy we all are, and our children are in school, right? And that pretty much sums up thriving.
which is fabulous. So let's expand on that a little bit. We know that women are disproportionately impacted by environmental degradation, deforestation, and climate change. Can you talk about how and where you've witnessed this in your work, and how, like the women in Madagascar, how they came up with solutions for that?
Yeah, I mean, it's so interesting. I mean, oh, it's so painful. Madagascar was like, I would say, over the edge, right? So the place, they've lost 90% of their forest in the last 10 years. The place we're working in, Munumbu Forest, is the last lowland rainforest left. And they don't have enough food to eat. The traditional form of agriculture is slash and burn. They cut down forests, they plant a crop of rice, it moves on. One person in one of these meetings said, our ancestors said that there will be forest until hens have teeth. And now we know that is not the case. We can see the end of the forest. And that meant, particularly when there is not enough food, it is a serious problem for women, right? Women who, and also no access to birth control. So women sometimes having 8 to 9 children, how hard that is on your body when you do not have enough calories. And then you're losing so many of your children. I mean, it's horrific. But they are no longer afraid of the hunger season now. They knew what the solutions were. They just didn't know how to get them, right? They needed just some training, right? And they needed a specific type of rice, and they needed healthcare access, right? One woman in one of the meetings, I said, can you help me understand what's more important? Because I hear you guys that healthcare is incredibly important and hunger is incredibly important. What's more important, to address the agricultural issues or to address the healthcare issues? She said, I cannot tell you which is number one. They are both number one. Because if you do not have healthcare, you're going to die. If you don't have food, you're going to die. Doesn't matter, right? And if you don't have both of them, you're not going to survive. And she's right. You know, and one of the major problems with most nonprofits is they're very siloed. We do just this or just this or just this, right? But you do just healthcare, or you do just, agricultural well-being, or you do just education. It's not enough, because you need all of them in place to be able to thrive.
So yeah, another thing that I love about Health in Harmony is that it is holistic. And some of the other organizations that we've worked with in similar but slightly different work, Community Cloud Forest Conservation in Guatemala is also doing a holistic approach. It's not just education, it's not just farming techniques, it's not just reforestation. It's a lot. And same with the Gorilla Fund that we learned about a couple of weeks ago.
Yeah.
What do you say to people that say, but are you doing too much? Shouldn't you just stay in your lane? Your lane, you trained to be a doctor. Shouldn't you just focus on the healthcare part? I mean, you talked about it already a little bit. It's the synergies, right? Everything is connected. It's like an onion.
Yeah. I would just repeat what this woman said in Madagascar, right? Like, yeah, okay. And I will admit, there are definitely sometimes when communities ask for solutions and we're like, we have not a clue about that, right? But we can find people who do, right? Or we can partner with other organizations that do know. And well, I'll give you an example from Brazil. So we're now working in Brazil. Brazil is a slightly different context. So in the Amazon rainforest, people live within the forest, indigenous people and traditional people who are caring for the forest and keeping the forest, invaders back. And that's different from places like Madagascar and Indonesia, where people are mostly living on the edge of the forest, and they're still very, the relationship with the forest is still very, very important, but it's not quite the same. They're not living off the forest, right? So there's one community that I just started working with that they have a lot of invaders, and they're really, and for many indigenous communities especially, the land is their identity. It's their sacred space. It is their livelihood. It is their traditions. It is their everything, right? And so losing the forest and having invaders come in is just the most horrible thing that can happen. That is the same as dying, right? And so when we asked these particular one community that had a lot of invaders, what were the solutions? This actually through a partner organization that we're now working with called Pawanka, which is an all indigenous led organization. So they worked with this indigenous group to ask what they saw as the solutions. And they said, we need to protect against invaders, right? And we need towers so that we can contact the authorities when people have invaded. We need training in how to do this, right? Do we know how to do that? No, we don't actually. That's not a skill that Health and Harmony has, but we can find groups that do. And that is what they're basically asking for. Help us find the people who can do this, and then they'll vet them and they'll see if that's a group they want to work with, so.
Yeah, great to hear about the expansion. Back for a minute to the disproportionate effect on women.
Yeah.
Obviously, it affects the whole family, but can you talk a little bit about the infant mortality rates and how that relates to the number of children that people have? Because for some people, it's not intuitive that you'd have more kids because the infant mortality rate is high. So can you address that?
Yeah, that was like a kind of like shocker moment for me too, when I tell the story in the book about how one of my friends, Ibu Sumiati, she asked me, how many kids do you want to have? And I said, well, I'd like to have two. And she said, two? Are you out of your mind? You can't have two? What if one of them dies? What if they both die? You can have at least four so you can be sure two will survive. And I was like, whoa, right? Like, okay, I'd never have made that calculation before in my life. But then I thought about it. Actually, I can be pretty sure that most of my kids are going to survive. And I happened to be doing a study at the time about the infant mortality in that region, and it was 25%. So she was hedging her bets. She was overestimating a little bit. She wanted two, but she was going to have four to be sure two would survive, but on average, she was going to end up with three, right? So you end up, which is the correct, she's right. It's the right calculation to make, right? But on average, you end up with more kids than you want.
But as infant mortality goes down, then people tend to have less children.
And they respond very quickly. Fascinatingly, I'm still friends with Ibu Sumiati. In fact, I paid for her youngest son to go all the way through college. And she only had two kids. And the infant mortality over that time, even by this like kind of second time I had done a study there, it was 12%, and then even lower after that. So yeah.
Phenomenal. So Together Women Rise has invested almost $100,000 in Health and Harmony.
Thank you.
Yeah, you are welcome, and thank you in return. So first we funded a featured grant in 2012 when we were Dining for Women, and then with a sustained grant in 2016 for 3 years, 2016, 2017, 2018. So one of the projects we funded was the Goats for Widows program, which is one of the programs that a lot of our members remember well. And
Yep.
It was one of the programs that the communities asked for, right? So
Yep.
Can you tell us a little bit more about that program? Why did the communities ask for that? And whether it's still working today?
Well, I'll tell you some funny stories about how whether or not it's working. Um, but first, I'll tell you that this is something that happens with radical listening, right? Communities come up with a solution, you begin to implement the solution, and then a new problem arises, and then you need to go back to the communities. What are the solutions now, right? What do we do? Because now we have this new problem. So the new problem that arose was after people asked for organic farming training. So they didn't actually know you could use manure to make fertilizer, and there was actually no price for manure in any of the communities. Although there was manure, right? Of course. But then once this training happened, then people started charging for manure. Then there was like not enough manure, and then people started hoarding manure. It was like they wouldn't sell it under any conditions. It was like, so this was just, oh, what do we do, right? We need to get more manure into communities. So then we had this meeting, and what do we do? And well, they thought that the best solution would be to give goats to widows. And the reason was because you can't, we're not going to be able to distribute goats to everyone, and that wouldn't be a good idea anyway. So you should give them to the most vulnerable members of the community and the people who are the poorest. And there's no one who's going to disagree with that. Everyone is going to think that's a good idea. And in Islam and in Christianity, which these are mixed communities there, there is a it's like a benefit, a spiritual benefit to assisting the poor, to assisting widows, in particular. And these women, so the term widow in Indonesia is a little complicated. It doesn't just mean people whose husbands have died, but it also means women whose husbands have left them, abandoned them, and are often have been gone for years. They're in an even worse position because they can't remarry, and they are very vulnerable, and it can be very challenging. So Monica Nirmala, who's our executive director for a long time, she and I at one point went on a little tour of the widows to see how they were doing. And every time we'd be driving up, I'd be like, that can't possibly be the house. I remember when we brought those goats. That house, we'd stop. Sure enough, that's the widow. But now she has a whole new huge house. She's got big, she's got a tin roof. Go inside. Yes, I've sent all my kids all the way through college. I'm like, these women are no longer the poorest people in the community. They are often the richest people in the community. And Monica and I are sitting there, we're talking to this one widow, and there's we gave her 2 goats in the beginning, and now she's got 20 some goats, right? And she's sold many of them, right? And Monica and I are sitting there, and Monica says, I think I should stop investing in the stock market. She's like, goats is a much better investment.
Oh, I love it. I love it. It's what a great one of the follow-up questions was how has your work played a role in advancing gender equality in Indonesia? I think we've got part of our answer right there. It's clearly elevated their position in the community, their personal circumstances. They've sent their kids to school. It sounds like a win-win. But can you talk about that a little bit? Our funds apparently also went for leadership development and training, for green kitchen gardens, small business development, for wives of loggers, to help encourage them to stop logging. And so how has that work played a role in advancing gender equality in Indonesia? And what is the status of women in the country today?
Well, in many ways, the status of women in Indonesia is remarkably good. It's a much more egalitarian society, and there's a lot of respect for women. But I have to say, I was a little surprised. Some years into our program, one man at the reforestation site came up to me and he said, because ASRI is a women-led organization, now we know women can do anything. And I was like, first of all, I was a little surprised that he felt that way about it, but also I was a little surprised that he perceived Austria as a women-led organization, which, okay, it's true. You know, Hotland and I were both women. It's true that the next head of the program, Monica Nirmala, and the next one were all women, and actually the one after that too. But and most of the heads of the clinic were women, but not all of the leaders were women. You know, it's like some of them were also men. But yeah, it's I do, and then that story I told from Madagascar, right, where the women also are now calling the meetings themselves. We found this in the reforestation work as well in Kalimantan, and now we're finding it as well in Madagascar, that the women are often better at organizing groups of people to work, and they often lead those groups. And in Brazil, one of the community leaders we've worked very closely with, Juma Shipaya, she's the head of her community, indigenous community. She's actually now in medical school as well. We actually took her to COP, to the Conference of Parties on climate change, sponsored her to go to, because we wanted voices from the communities really also to be there and to be really advocating for the change. She's the most powerful woman imaginable. You know, it's such an honor to get to honestly just sit at her feet. You know, yeah.
Fabulous. We love hearing all of these success stories and the positive change that clearly has happened, continues to happen. One of our listeners here tonight said women do more radical listening. I think, yeah.
We do usually have women be the listeners, and there is a reason.
Well, I know in trying to ramp this up and go other places, you've also looked at what is the magic sauce. What are the ingredients that make this workable, and you know, does that translate to other places? And towards the end of the book, you did say that you wondered if part of it was that there are so many women in leadership. So it'll be interesting if you can figure out a way to measure that, and whether that is part of the formula.
Yeah, it is hard to figure out how to measure it, you know, except when people say things to you like, now we know women can do anything. You know? But I do think there is an element as well of trust, especially for women actually in the communities, that they're more likely to trust when the listeners are women and feel safe to speak. Yeah.
Well, I know we want to get to audience questions. We did ask if you would mind doing a reading. So while people are adding their questions, if you want to read for us, and then Wendy will take over with some of the questions that we have from the people who are with us today.
Okay, so so I'm going to tell a story about someone in a meeting, an organic farming training that we did in Kalimantan. The man sitting on my left, who had been looking quite pale, was just beginning to stand up when he wavered and started to collapse. I managed to catch him before he hit the ground, and as soon as my hands touched him, I knew he had a fever. We called the ambulance and brought Pat Din, that was his name, to the clinic. And there he proceeded to tell us his amazing story. 12 years previously, he had fallen from the top of a 20-meter, 6-story coconut palm. The fall broke his back and smashed up his left foot. For 2 years, he couldn't get out of bed, but finally he forced himself to learn to walk again. His gait was still not normal, but he could get around. The problem was that injured foot never did heal. It had drained pus for 12 years. Every year or so, he would get deathly ill with fevers and shaking. This was what was happening to him now. The bacteria from the chronic infection in his foot bones was proliferating in his bloodstream, and if it wasn't treated, it might very well kill him. One of the doctors put him on intravenous antibiotics and gave him lots of fluids while our nurse skillfully worked on cleaning out the wound, cutting back the infected tissue and bone. The next morning, I came in to check on him and was delighted to see how much better he looked. Good morning, I said, almost laughing with pleasure. You look great. Yes. Please take out my IV. I want to go back to the training right away. I don't want to miss a thing. I'm sorry, but you do not look that good, I told him with a real laugh. You are still very sick. You need to stay in bed. Also, we need you to stay on intravenous antibiotics for a few more weeks. And when you go home, you will need to take antibiotics in pill form for even longer. I think we have a good chance to cure you, but it could take a long time. There is no need for you to go to the training. Just rest here in the clinic and we can take care of you until you're well enough to go home. No, you do not understand, Pat Din insisted. In the first organic farming training, I learned how to make compost, and I doubled the amount I'm harvesting from my pineapples. I also grow herbs and eggplants, and now I don't have to buy expensive chemical fertilizers. I am making twice what I used to, and the cost of fertilizer is vastly cheaper than what I used to pay. I can even afford to send my children to school. There is no way you are going to keep me in this bed. I want to learn more. What could I say? After some negotiation, we came to an agreement. Pat Din would attend the next 4 days of the training, but he would sleep in the clinic every night and get antibiotic shots twice daily. So it seemed that our integrated approach of tackling the problems from many different angles at the same time was bearing fruit, literally and figuratively. Pat Din's story illustrates this process perfectly. With the appropriate medical care and a way to pay for it, in combination with the farming training, everything in his life could get better. To pay for his medicines, Pat Din worked in the clinic's organic farm and at the same time learned even more, like how to make natural pesticides from local plants. And now he could send his children to school, where they too were learning additional skills. Simply curing him physically would have been good. Giving him training in sustainable agriculture would have helped. Or just working with his community to protect the rainforest, the watershed for his rice fields, would have benefited him. But the combination of all three worked synergistically. Health and Harmony's board chair, Joe Whitehouse, once summed it up perfectly. Synergistic means 1 + 1 is equal to 11. Reversing the negative spiral requires both gaining new knowledge and an internal willingness to move to a new way of life. Yeah, so I'll leave it at that. I want to leave more room for space for questions.
Thank you for doing that. I love when our authors read from the book because it just really brings it to life even more than when we read it. So yes, we have a bunch of questions. First one is radical listening. Are you starting to see some changes within other NGOs in terms of radical listening?
Oh, thank you. Perfect question. You set me up beautifully. So, yes. So the thing that amazes me, so many of the big ones and some of the ones that maybe have done this the least are now coming to us knowing that some of the ways they operate can be very colonial and asking for help. We have now also super excitingly formed a partnership with Doctors Without Borders, who recognize that they could use some help in learning to listen. They also recognize that they have a problem, which is that they are dealing with humanitarian crises that often originally begin with an environmental crisis that can often sometimes lead to conflict that then leads to more problems, right? And so they really recognize that they're treating malnutrition in children with plumpy nut that was made in the United States and in a plastic, package. They're not addressing the reason that child has malnutrition, right? So they really get that this is it's not working. And so we're in a partnership with them now in the Congo region of Madagascar. So it's like a three-way partnership. There's a Malagasy organization also called Ni Tanin Sik. And so the we did training with the two of them, and now a member from each of those organizations has done radical listening in a population of about 160,000 people. They had many, I think it was over 60 meetings, like a huge number of meetings. And maybe it was over 100, I can't remember. It was a lot of meetings. And real clarity about exactly what the solutions are for healthcare, which then Doctors Without Borders will address, then some of the livelihood and sanitation and water access issues, which will be addressed by Neem, Tun, and Seek. And then we will also be sort of filling in on the corners where things are what's left. So yeah, that's been really exciting for us to see, because Doctors Without Borders is imagining that if this goes well, then that's something they would like to roll out more globally. But we're training lots of organizations, and I will say we are even training like the worst of the worst, like USAID. Like when USAID came to us and we're like, we need help. And I was like, you do know who you work for, don't you? I was like,
That's big time. That's big time.
Yeah, but we are actually changing even their process of how they request, how they're called request for proposals, RFPs, right? So they're actually changing that process to be more responsive to what communities need in the first place. So
well, I'm sure that if we let Beverly jump in here, she'd tell you about our wonderful transformation partnerships and how we're trying to also work much more in partnership with local communities and organizations to make systemic change. I just have to put in that little plug for Together Women Rise. Next question. So as a memoir, your book provides a very honest look on how leading this incredible movement has affected you personally. And what have you learned that you can share with young people and others about leading change while also taking care of yourself? And there's actually several questions in the chat about whether you still take sabbaticals, because that had such a profound impact on your personal health, and how you're currently managing your personal health, and really how your health in general is right now after that jellyfish sting.
Yeah. So I will say that, and this was like really one of the key, I didn't realize it until I had written the book, but then it was like so obvious to me. Personal healing is community healing, is global healing. Like they're inseparable. They are inseparable. And when I try to think about thriving for the planet, I think about thriving for every one of our staff. I think about thriving for me. I think about thriving for my family. I think about it must all be together. And I have been very lucky. I am pretty much 95% recovered from the jellyfish sting. But yes, I still take sabbaticals. And actually, I'll share some very exciting news. So just a few days old, we have signed a contract with a production company to potentially turn my book, or the themes in my book, into a streaming series. So we'll see.
That is incredible news. That is so exciting. When is all this going to happen?
Yeah, it probably will take at least a year or even two from now until it's actually out. I mean, it depends on if this, so what happens is you write a pilot and then the streaming networks bid on it and they decide whether or not they want it. And so we'll see. It's many steps from now till then, but we'll see. Hopefully that happens, because I do feel like these stories about hope, about an anti-colonial way of truly listening to communities, an intersectional approach, a loving, respectful approach that is truly about thriving for everyone, and that solutions are possible, and that change is possible really quite quickly. I feel like that message so desperately needs to get out there. and how dependent our whole planet is on these rainforests. You know, they're 2% of the surface of the earth, but they are absolutely essential. We will not make it if we do not have them. So, yeah.
Well, that's exciting that you shared that little bit of news for the future. What other projects you mentioned right at the beginning, I think before we got started, that you were going to be working in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. What other projects are you working on? And someone said another book, maybe?
Yes, actually, The Art of Radical Listening coming out very soon.
Oh, wow.
Yep. But what are we working on? My goodness, we are working on scaling. We are working on trying to figure out how to take these ideas to the entire tropics, right? And we're working on that in different ways. So one scaling mechanism is with large NGO partners. I told you about that with MSF. Another one is actually with the Indonesian government. We are partnering with them to think about how to scale across all of Indonesia. And that's in partnership with the Ministry of Health. And number 2 at the Ministry of Health at the moment, Monica Nirmala, used to be our executive director. She then went to Harvard, came back. She's incredible. So that's like also really happening. And then we're also partnering in this coalition. So with Pawanka Fund, I told you about them. So they are this indigenous-led organization who has contacts with indigenous communities all over the world. And so really channeling funds directly to communities through them is also, that's a very exciting way. We're really starting that across Brazil. So that's, okay. So all of that. And then I am also 15 weeks pregnant with my second child. so that's a big thing I'm doing. And then the streaming thing.
That's a new project. Yep.
That's a new project. And then I am really also very aware that there's a role for founders, and that founders also need to step back and they need to create room for, especially for me, this is very important. We have so many incredible leaders of color within our organization. And I want to create space for them to just really be the forefront and lead. And so I'm actually beginning the process of stepping back more. Yeah.
Well, those all sound like hugely exciting steps for the future. We are running out of time for questions. There's still a lot in the chat, but I'm going to wrap it up with this one. Is there any small everyday things that we as consumers can do to make a difference, whether it's for the rainforests in Indonesia or any other way to help heal our planet? And someone just put a note in there how they bought something at Costco recently and realized that it had palm oil in it and is bringing it right back. And I'll tell you, I was made much more aware of how I need to pay attention to those kinds of things, especially the palm oil plantations and all the devastation they've created.
Yeah, so it is not just the palm oil, right? It is, although that's important, it is, I want us all, every one of us, every day to think about inner being, to think about the fact that we are dependent on a healthy ecosystem. That, think about it with plastic, think about it with carbon emissions, think about it with our relations to other humans on this planet, right? And we are dependent on all of our well-being, right? It's all intertwined. And so if people are suffering to make something that we don't really need, that's also not contributing to thriving. So yeah, I think about how can we, in everything we do, honor ourselves, honor our own health and well-being, honor our community health and well-being, and honor the planet's health and well-being. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Vicki. I'm going to turn it back over to you now.
I think Jan's wrapping us up, but
Sorry, you're right.
Yeah. No, this was fabulous. Thank you so much. We had a great conversation. Obviously, we wish we had more time, but Jan, take us out.
There we go. Sorry, I couldn't unmute for some reason. It was resisting me. Okay, this has been wonderful, and I just want to remind everyone, particularly those who may not be members of Together Women Rise chapters, that we depend on your donations to fund projects around the world and to provide these powerful learning opportunities and to support programs like the ones we've heard about today. Please visit our website at togetherwomenrise.org or click on the link in the chat to support our work. And just a few paid political announcements here. We're excited to announce the next 2 book club selections. The first will be Radical Inclusion by Dr. David Moina Sagay, Chief Minister and Chief Innovation Officer for the government of Sierra Leone. His book details the author's efforts to lift the ban on pregnant girls attending schools. The next one will be Last to Eat, Last to Learn, My Life in Afghanistan, Fighting to Educate Women by Peshtana Durrani. We'll be firming up dates for those. Hopefully we'll be able to have authors speak at those as well. We'll do our best to make that happen. And we would like to encourage people to join our Goodreads group because we can continue this conversation. The questions that you may still have, we would encourage you to ask one another these questions, and maybe we can even encourage Kinari to join our Goodreads group and address some of those questions if there are furthers. Other upcoming events. We have a monthly webinar on the first Thursday of every month in which our featured grantees are presented. And the one on May 3rd will be featuring Fistula Foundation as well as One Heart Worldwide. We have an advocacy seminar on Tuesday, May 21st, which is an important aspect of our work, helping us get the word out to the leadership within our country about the plight that is going on worldwide and what we can do. I'd also like to highlight the registration for our upcoming trips. Those of you that were on early maybe heard some conversation about folks that have just returned from a wonderful trip, and we do trips several times a year. We have one to Malawi in October, Cambodia in November, and these are great opportunities to firsthand witness the impact that we're making and to learn more about the country and the culture and the challenges faced by women and girls. All of our trips, the book club selections, and all the events are posted on upcoming events page on our website. Okay, time for the book giveaway. We're going to spin the prize wheel and give away 3 copies of one of our upcoming books. Wendy, you want to go ahead and spin that wheel?
Right. Deborah Lee, yay.
Wonderful, thank you.
Thanks. Dorothy Peters. And by the way, the prize will be one of our upcoming selections. So one of the 2 books that Jan mentioned. And Carola Ratzlaff, I hope I'm saying that right. We will be in touch with all 3 of you to make arrangements to get one of the books to you. And that wraps things up for this evening. Thank you once again to our amazing speaker. Thank you to Jan and Vicky and our entire book club committee for making this happen. And thanks to everyone for attending tonight. Tell everyone that they need to watch this recording.
And read the book.
And read the book. Yes.
Absolutely.
Thanks, Vicky. Good night,
And
everyone.
and I've been answering some of the questions in the chat. So if you
That's great.
quick
That's great.
look at your question, see if I answered it.
No surprise.
Thank you, Dr. Webb.
That's great.
Wonderful.
Thank you, Dr. Webb. Thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you for your inspiration.
Yes.
Oh, well, thank you all for all the wonderful work you do in the world. It's so important.
What a delightful evening. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. What an inspiration.
Aw, thanks.
Isn't it such a feel-good thing to get in front of our community? They're also positive and affirming. And you
So
certainly
excited that you
inspire.
have even one child. I didn't know about your one child. So I'm very excited that you've got a second one coming.
I mean, I've always been very crazy and I am 52, so it is super crazy to be having a child now, but there you go.
You're not with Cam, are you?
Nope.
Okay.
He is delightedly remarried and living in Alaska to one of my dear friends from college, and I am so happy about it. So
There's definitely another book here that we need this. We need
I know.
book two, the sequel. Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, keep us posted about your next book, because we would love
Yes.
Great.
to feature
Yeah.
that as well, and also about the series. That sounds so exciting, and we'll be watching for that for sure. But thank you so much.
thank you.
Thank you.
Good night, everyone.
Good night.